The howling wind carried the infant's cries across the desolate prairie as the last embers of the dying fire threatened to surrender to the encroaching darkness. Grace Goodwin clutched her baby closer to her chest, shivering against the October chill that swept through the Wyoming territory in 1876. Her tears mingled with the soot on her face as she contemplated their dire situation: no food, no shelter, and winter's approach growing more menacing with each passing day. The distant thunder of hooves broke through the baby's wails. Grace tensed, one arm protectively curling around her 6-month-old daughter, the other reaching for the small knife hidden in the folds of her tattered skirt. In these untamed lands, strangers often meant danger rather than salvation. A lone rider emerged from the gathering dusk, his broad-shouldered silhouette backlit by the setting sun. He slowed his horse to a walk, approaching cautiously as if sensing her fear. The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. "Madam," he called, keeping a respectful distance, his voice deep but gentle. "You and your little one all right out here?" Grace remained silent, weighing her limited options. The baby's cries intensified as if protesting their circumstances. The man stepped closer, and in the fading light, Grace could make out his features: kind eyes in a weathered face, a strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard, and a mouth set in a concerned line. His clothes were dusty but well kept, marking him as a working man rather than a drifter. "Name's Garrett Prescott," he said, removing his hat. "I've got a place about 3 miles east of here, not much, but it's warm and dry." His eyes moved from her face to the crying infant and back again. "Whatever trouble you're running from, it can't be worse than freezing to death out here tonight." Grace swallowed hard, fighting the dizziness that threatened to overcome her. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, saving what little food remained for her daughter. Garrett must have noticed her weakened state because he moved forward with sudden decision. Kneeling beside her, he gently took in the scene: the dying fire, her gaunt face, the wailing infant, and the small bundle of possessions beside her. "You can't stay here, madam," he said softly, genuine concern evident in his voice. "Storm's coming. Be here before midnight by my reckoning." As if to confirm his words, the wind picked up, sending a shower of sparks from the dwindling fire. The baby's cries grew more frantic. With gentle hands that belied his rugged appearance, Garrett carefully gathered both Grace and her daughter in his arms. The warmth of his body against hers was the first comfort Grace had felt in days. "Come home with me," he said simply, his words a lifeline in the wilderness. "At least until the storm passes." Something in his eyes, perhaps the complete absence of threat or demand, made Grace nod in silent acquiescence. She had nowhere else to go, and her daughter's life depended on finding shelter before the night turned deadly cold. He settled her and the baby onto his horse, gathered her meager belongings, and then mounted behind her. His arms formed a protective circle around them as he took the reins. The solid presence of his chest against her back offered security Grace hadn't experienced since her husband's death 4 months earlier. As Garrett guided the horse eastward, Grace's exhaustion finally overtook her, and she surrendered to unconsciousness, trusting this stranger with their lives. When Grace awakened, she found herself on a narrow but comfortable bed in a small, tidy cabin. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, filling the room with blessed warmth. For a moment, panic seized her. Where was her baby? "She's right here, madam," Garrett's voice came from the rocking chair near the fire. "Been sleeping peaceful for about an hour now." Relief flooded through Grace as she saw her daughter cradled securely in the cowboy's strong arms. He held the infant with surprising tenderness, one large finger caught in her tiny hand. "Thank you," Grace whispered, her voice raspy, "for helping us." Garrett nodded, his expression a mixture of concern and something else: compassion, perhaps. "You've been asleep for nearly 6 hours. Figured you needed the rest." He gestured toward the small table where a bowl of stew sat steaming. "Made some food if you're hungry." Grace's stomach answered with an embarrassing growl, and Garrett's mouth twitched in a half-smile. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, carefully rising with the baby still in his arms. "Can sit with her while you eat, if that's all right." Grace nodded, slowly swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She noticed someone Garrett obviously had removed her mud-caked boots, but had otherwise left her fully clothed. A gesture of respect she appreciated. The stew was simple but delicious venison with potatoes and carrots. Grace forced herself to eat slowly despite her hunger. As she ate, she studied her surroundings more carefully. The cabin was modest but well-built and immaculately maintained. A bookshelf held an impressive collection of volumes, not what she'd expected from a cowboy. "Your name, madam?" Garrett asked after allowing her to eat in silence for several minutes. "Grace," she answered, seeing no reason to withhold that much. "Grace Goodwin, and my daughter is Ella." "Pretty names," he replied, gently rocking the sleeping infant. "If you don't mind my asking, what brought you out to the middle of nowhere with a baby and not much else?" Grace set down her spoon, suddenly finding it difficult to swallow. The memories were still too raw, too painful. "My husband died 4 months ago. Fever took him in 3 days." She paused, fighting back tears. "We had a small farm near Laramie. After Thomas died, I couldn't keep up with the work or the payments. The bank took everything last week." Garrett's expression darkened. "Shouldn't have put a woman and baby out with winter coming. That ain't right. They gave me what they called a fair settlement, barely enough for a stagecoach ticket." Grace's laugh held no humor. "I was heading to my cousin's place in Montana, but the stage was robbed yesterday. The bandits took everything, my money, my food, even my wedding ring." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "I started walking, thinking I'd reach the next town, but I got turned around in these hills." Garrett nodded slowly. "Nearest town's Fort Laramie, about 15 miles southwest." He glanced toward the window, where rain now lashed against the glass. "But you won't be going anywhere for a few days. This storm's settling in." Grace's shoulders slumped. "I can't impose on you." "It's no imposition," Garrett said firmly. "Got plenty of food, and you're welcome to stay until you figure out your next step." He looked down at Ella, who stirred slightly in his arms. Little ones need shelter and stability. Something in his tone suggested personal knowledge of this truth, but Grace was too exhausted to puzzle over it now. "Thank you," she said simply. "We'll move on as soon as the weather clears." Garrett nodded, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't convinced of the wisdom of her plan. "You should get some more rest. I'll keep an eye on Ella." Normally, Grace would never have entrusted her precious daughter to a stranger, but extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary trust. Besides, there was something about Garrett Prescott that inspired confidence, a steadiness, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the small cabin. "She'll need feeding soon," Grace said. "I'll bring her to you when she wakes," he promised. Grace nodded gratefully and sank back onto the bed. Despite her intention to remain alert, the combination of warmth, a full stomach, and the reassuring presence of this kind stranger quickly lulled her back to sleep. The next morning, Grace awoke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a disorienting moment, she thought she was back on her farm with Thomas before reality reasserted itself. She sat up, immediately searching for Ella. Her daughter lay in a makeshift cradle, a wooden crate lined with soft blankets near the bed. The baby was awake, contentedly gumming her fist and kicking her feet. "Good morning," Garrett's voice came from the cooking area. "Storm blew through faster than I expected. Sun's out, but everything's muddy. Roads will be near impassable for a day or two." Grace picked up Ella, kissing her downy head. "You've been very kind, Mr. Prescott. I don't know how to thank you." "Garrett," he corrected, bringing her a cup of coffee. "And no thanks needed. Couldn't leave you both out there." He hesitated, then added, "Made some flapjacks if you're hungry." Over breakfast, Grace learned more about her rescuer. Garrett had come west from Pennsylvania after the war, working as a ranch hand before saving enough to buy his own small spread 5 years ago. He ran a modest herd of cattle and did some horse breeding on the side. "It's not much," he said with a shrug, "but it's mine, free and clear." There was pride in his voice, but no boastfulness. Grace found herself warming to his straightforward manner and quiet strength. "Do you have family nearby?" she asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Lost my parents before the war. No brothers or sisters." He was silent for a moment, then added, was engaged once, but she didn't care for frontier life. Went back east in '71. Grace nodded, understanding the loneliness that seemed to hover around him despite his self-sufficiency. "It's hard to be alone out here," she said softly. Garrett looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. "Gets quiet sometimes," he admitted. "But I've got good neighbors about 5 miles west the Hendersons. They check in when they can." As they talked, Grace realized that Garrett was younger than she'd initially thought, probably no more than 30, just a few years older than her 25 years. The weathering on his face came from working outdoors, not age. After breakfast, Garrett excused himself to tend to his livestock. Grace used the opportunity to wash herself, and Ella using the basin of water he'd provided. The simple act of being clean again lifted her spirits considerably. When Garrett returned, he brought with him some of his neighbors' hand-me-downs clothing that had belonged to their daughter-in-law and grandson before they moved to California. "Mrs. Henderson said you're welcome to these," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed as he handed over the bundle. "Thought they might fit you, and the little one better than what you've got." Grace accepted the clothing gratefully. The dress was a simple calico print, slightly worn but clean and whole, a vast improvement over her mud-stained garments. The baby clothes were similarly well-used but serviceable. "Please thank them for me," she said, touched by the generosity of people she'd never met. "This is very kind." Garrett nodded, then cleared his throat. "I need to ride out and check the west pasture fence. Storm might have knocked it down. Will you be all right here for a few hours?" "Of course," Grace assured him. "We'll be fine." After he left, Grace changed into the donated dress, which fit reasonably well, and dressed Ella in a clean gown. With her immediate needs addressed, she set about repaying Garrett's kindness in the only way she could, by tidying his cabin. It was already neat, but she swept the floor, washed the breakfast dishes, and organized the few items that seemed out of place. The physical activity helped clear her mind, allowing her to think about what she should do next. Her cousin in Montana was her only remaining family, but Grace had no way to reach her without money. Finding work would be essential, but jobs for women, especially those with infants, were scarce in frontier towns. As she cleaned, Grace noticed a photograph on the small desk in the corner. Curious, she picked it up. It showed a much younger Garrett in a Union Army uniform, standing next to another soldier who bore enough resemblance to be his brother. She set it down carefully, feeling as though she'd intruded on something private. By the time Garrett returned in the late afternoon, Grace had prepared a simple meal using provisions from his well-stocked pantry. The surprise on his face when he entered to find dinner waiting was almost comical. "You didn't have to do this," he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "I wanted to," Grace replied. "It's the least I can do to thank you." They ate together, the conversation flowing more easily than the night before. Grace found herself smiling at Garrett's dry humor and thoughtful observations. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something other than grief and fear, a tentative warmth, a cautious hope. As darkness fell, Garrett insisted Grace and Ella continue to use the bed while he slept on a bedroll near the fire. "I've slept under the stars plenty of times," he said when she protested. "This is luxury by comparison." In the quiet darkness, listening to Ella's soft breathing and Garrett's occasional movements as he stoked the fire, Grace allowed herself to acknowledge the truth: she had nowhere to go and no means to get there. The thought should have terrified her, but somehow, in this snug cabin with this honorable man nearby, the future seemed less daunting than it had by that dying fire the day before. The next morning brought sunshine, and a proposal from Garrett that caught Grace completely off guard. "I've been thinking," he said as they finished breakfast. "Roads won't be good for travel for at least another day or two, and even then you'd need money for the stagecoach." He hesitated, then continued. "The Hendersons are leaving for Denver tomorrow, going to stay with their son for the winter. They've asked me to keep an eye on their place until spring." Grace waited, not sure where this was leading. "What I mean to say is," Garrett continued, looking somewhat uncomfortable, "you and Ella could stay at their place if you wanted. It's bigger than this cabin, got 2 proper bedrooms. They'd be glad to know someone was living there, keeping it from sitting empty all winter." Grace stared at him, processing this unexpected offer. You'd let us stay in your neighbor's home for the whole winter, Garrett nodded. It would give you time to save some money, figure out your next steps without rushing. He met her eyes directly. I could use some help with bookkeeping for the ranch. My figures always get tangled, could pay you fair wages for that. The offer was startlingly generous, but Grace was wary of accepting charity. I wouldn't want to be a burden. You wouldn't be, Garrett assured her. Having someone nearby would be helpful to me too. Winter gets long out here alone. Grace considered the proposal. It would provide shelter and income through the harsh Wyoming winter, allowing her to save for their journey to Montana in the spring. More importantly, it would give Ella stability during these crucial months. I accept, she said finally. Thank you, Garrett. This means more than I can say. A rare smile transformed his usually serious face. Good. That's good. That afternoon, Garrett took Grace and Ella to meet the Hendersons, an elderly couple who welcomed them with immediate warmth. Mrs. Henderson fussed over Ella while Mr. Henderson showed Grace around their modest but comfortable home. We're pleased you'll be staying here, Mrs. Henderson told Grace. Been worried about Garrett all alone these past winters. Man needs company, especially when the snow gets deep. There was something knowing in the older woman's gaze that made Grace blush, but she merely thanked them for their generosity. The Hendersons departed the following day, leaving Grace and Ella settled in their temporary home. It was luxurious compared to Garrett's cabin, a proper two-bedroom house with a parlor, kitchen, and small study. After months of hardship, the simple comforts felt almost decadent. True to his word, Garrett brought over his account books and ledgers. Grace, who had handled the farm's finances during Thomas's frequent absences, found the work straightforward. Garrett's records were meticulous if somewhat disorganized, and she soon had everything in proper order. A routine developed over the following weeks. Garrett would ride over in the mornings, checking that Grace and Ella had everything they needed. Often, he would stay for breakfast, which Grace insisted on preparing. In the afternoons, he tended to his ranch work while Grace kept the accounts, maintained the Henderson home, and cared for Ella. Most evenings, Garrett returned for supper, bringing fresh meat or vegetables from his root cellar. After the meal, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading in companionable silence while Ella played on a blanket between them. As November deepened into December, Grace found herself looking forward to these quiet evenings more and more. Garrett was nothing like her late husband, where Thomas had been gregarious and impulsive. Garrett was thoughtful and steady. Yet there was a depth to him that fascinated her, a quiet intelligence and unexpected tenderness that emerged most clearly when he interacted with Ella. The baby had taken to Garrett completely, reaching for him when he entered a room and falling asleep contentedly in his arms. For his part, Garrett seemed equally enchanted with the infant, bringing her small gifts, a carved wooden rattle, a soft rabbit pelt fashioned into a doll, and spending hours entertaining her with stories and songs. One evening in mid-December, as a snowstorm howled outside, Grace found herself watching Garrett as he gently rocked Ella to sleep. The firelight cast his profile in gold, softening the angles of his face. A profound emotion welled up within her, not quite love, not yet, but something equally powerful, gratitude, perhaps, or the recognition of his fundamental goodness. "You're very good with her," Grace said softly. Garrett glanced up, a hint of color touching his cheekbones. "She makes it easy." "Smart little thing. She trusts you," Grace continued. "Babies know good people." Garrett looked down at the sleeping infant. "Never spent much time around children before. Didn't know what I was missing." The simple statement revealed more than any lengthy confession could have. Grace realized that Garrett's solitary life hadn't been entirely by choice. He'd simply never found the family he clearly longed for. As Christmas approached, Grace wanted to do something special to thank Garrett for his kindness. Using scraps of fabric from Mrs. Henderson's sewing basket, she secretly made him a quilt, working on it during the hours he was away tending his ranch. It wasn't elaborate, simple squares in blues and browns, but she put careful stitches into every seam, hoping it would keep him warm during the long winter nights in his cabin. On Christmas Eve, Garrett arrived carrying a small pine tree he'd cut from his property. Together, they set it up in the parlor and decorated it with paper chains Grace had made and pine cones gathered from the yard. The simple decorations transformed the room, bringing festive cheer that Grace hadn't expected to feel that difficult year. After they put Ella to bed, Grace brought out the carefully wrapped quilt. "I wanted to give you something," she said, suddenly shy. "To thank you for everything you've done for us." Garrett looked genuinely surprised as he unwrapped the gift. His fingers traced the pattern of squares, lingering on the neat stitching. "You made this?" he asked, his voice husky. "For me?" Grace nodded, watching his face anxiously. "Is it all right? I know it's not much. It's more than anyone's given me in years," Garrett interrupted, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you, Grace. I'll treasure it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 small packages. "Got something for you and Ella, too." Ella's gift was a tiny silver rattle, clearly expensive and obviously purchased during one of Garrett's infrequent trips into town. Grace's package contained a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a rose. "It was my mother's," Garrett explained, watching as Grace examined the beautiful piece. "Only thing of hers I have left. Thought it should belong to a woman again, not sit in a drawer." Grace was speechless, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. "Garrett, I can't accept this. It's too precious." "Please," he said quietly. "I want you to have it." Their eyes met over the small silver piece, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily over the past weeks. Garrett leaned forward slowly, giving Grace ample time to move away if she wished. Instead, she met him halfway, their lips touching in a gentle, questioning kiss. It was brief but perfect, a promise rather than a demand. When they separated, Garrett's expression was a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. "I didn't plan this," he said. "When I found you by that fire, I never thought." "I know," Grace assured him, touching his weathered cheek. "Neither did I." They sat together by the fire late into the night, talking of their pasts and cautiously of possible futures. Garrett spoke of his time in the war, of the brother he'd lost at Gettysburg, the young man from the photograph, and of his dreams for his ranch. Grace told him about growing up in Ohio, about meeting Thomas at a church social, and about their journey west filled with hopes that had ended in tragedy. "I never expected to find happiness again," Grace admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over." Garrett took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Life has a way of surprising us," he said softly, "sometimes with sorrow, sometimes with joy." Snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in pristine white, while inside the warm parlor, 2 lonely souls found unexpected comfort in each other's company. The weeks following Christmas brought the harshest weather of the season. Heavy snows isolated the ranch, making travel nearly impossible. Garrett moved temporarily into the Hendersons' barn loft, unwilling to risk being separated from Grace and Ella by impassable roads. Each morning, he dug paths through the snow between the barn and house, tended to his few animals sheltered there, and spent the remainder of the day with Grace and Ella. These snowbound days created a domestic intimacy that allowed their relationship to deepen naturally. They learned each other's habits and preferences, discovered shared interests in books and music, and found that their different temperaments complemented rather than conflicted. Grace's natural vivacity balanced Garrett's more reserved nature, while his steadiness provided an anchor for her sometimes impulsive spirit. Ella thrived under their combined care, learning to crawl and beginning to form simple words. Her first clear utterance, "Gah," for Garrett brought tears to the cowboy's eyes, though he tried to hide them by pretending to search for something in his pocket. One evening in late January, as they sat before the fire with Ella sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Garrett cleared his throat nervously. "Been thinking about spring," he began, poking at the fire with more concentration than the task required. Grace's heart sank. Spring meant the end of their arrangement. The Hendersons would return, and she would need to continue to her cousins in Montana as originally planned. "I know," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We should start making preparations. The stagecoach routes will reopen once the pass is clear." Garrett set down the poker and turned to face her directly. "That's not what I meant," he said. "I don't want you to go." Grace's breath caught. "What are you saying, Garrett?" He took her hand, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "I'm saying I've fallen in love with you, Grace Goodwin, with you and with Ella, and I'm asking if you might consider staying. Permanently." Joy bubbled up within Grace, but caution tempered her response. "Are you proposing marriage, Garrett Prescott?" A slow smile spread across his face. "I reckon I am, though I'm making a poor job of it." He slid from his chair to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "I don't have much to offer beyond my heart and my home, but both are yours if you want them." Grace studied his earnest face, this man who had saved her and Ella from certain death, who had opened his life to them with unstinting generosity, who had never once made her feel like a charity case or an obligation. "I do want them," she said softly, "very much." The kiss they shared sealed their commitment to each other, a promise of partnership and love in the challenging but rewarding life that lay ahead. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony conducted by the circuit preacher who stopped at ranches and homesteads throughout the region. The Hendersons' kitchen served as both chapel and reception hall, with only a few neighboring ranchers as witnesses. Grace wore her calico dress with Mrs. Henderson's borrowed shawl and carried wildflowers Garrett had somehow found growing in a sheltered southern slope. Ella, dressed in her best gown, was held by Mrs. Henderson, who wept happy tears throughout the brief service. The simple gold band Garrett placed on Grace's finger had belonged to his grandmother. "It's been waiting for the right hand," he told her as he slipped it on. "Just like I've been waiting for the right heart." After the guests departed, Garrett carried Grace across the threshold of his cabin, now their cabin with Ella in her arms. He had spent the previous week secretly enlarging and improving the small dwelling, adding a proper bedroom and reinforcing the roof and walls against winter storms. "Welcome home," he said, setting her gently on her feet. "Home," Grace repeated, the word filling her with contentment. After months of uncertainty and fear, she had found not just shelter but belonging. That night, after Ella was asleep in the cradle Garrett had crafted for her, husband and wife came together in the tender consummation of their marriage. Grace discovered that Garrett's gentle strength extended to this most intimate act, his consideration for her comfort and pleasure making their union a true expression of love rather than mere physical need. As they lay together afterward, Grace's head resting on Garrett's chest, he stroked her hair and spoke of his plans for their future, expanding the ranch, building a larger house, perhaps adding more children to their family. Grace listened, offering her own ideas and suggestions, marveling at how naturally they had become a partnership. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, bringing new calves to the ranch and wildflowers to the prairie. Grace planted a vegetable garden beside the cabin, with Garrett's help turning the soil and building a fence to keep out rabbits and deer. Ella took her first steps on the packed earth of the yard, tottering between her parents with delighted squeals. The Hendersons returned from Denver, overjoyed to find Grace and Garrett married. They insisted on hosting a proper wedding celebration, inviting people from miles around to welcome Grace officially to the community. The gathering turned into a combination housewarming and wedding party, with neighbors bringing gifts, food, and genuine goodwill. "Knew it would work out this way," Mrs. Henderson confided to Grace as they watched Garrett showing Ella to proud neighbors. "That man needed a family. Just needed a little push from Providence to find one," Grace smiled, remembering the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. "Providence works in mysterious ways," she agreed. As summer progressed, Grace discovered she was expecting a child, their child. When she told Garrett the news, his joy was profound. He lifted her in his arms, spinning her around before setting her down with sudden concern. "Should I not have done that? I don't want to hurt you or the baby," Grace laughed, touched by his protective instinct. "I'm with child, not made of china," she assured him. "But I appreciate your concern." They shared the news with Ella by explaining she would be a big sister. Though not fully understanding, the toddler seemed pleased by her parents' excitement, patting Grace's still flat stomach with gentle hands. The months passed in a rhythm of work and love, the ranch thriving under their joint care. Garrett's cattle herd increased, and his reputation for fine horses spread throughout the territory. Grace's garden yielded abundant produce, much of which she preserved for the coming winter. Together, they expanded the cabin further, adding another bedroom for the coming child and improving the kitchen to make Grace's work easier. In late January of 1878, as a snowstorm raged outside reminiscent of the one during their first Christmas together, Grace gave birth to a son. The labor was difficult but uncomplicated, with Mrs. Henderson serving as midwife while Garrett paced anxiously outside with Ella. When finally allowed to enter, Garrett approached the bed with reverence, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in Grace's arms. "He's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the infant's tiny hand. "Just like his mama." They named him William Thomas Prescott William for Garrett's fallen brother, Thomas for Grace's first husband. It seemed fitting to honor those who had shaped their past, even as they built their future together. Ella approached her new brother with solemn curiosity, leaning carefully over the bed to peer at his red, wrinkled face. "Baby," she said decisively, reaching out to touch his cheek. "My baby." "That's right," Grace told her, making room for the toddler beside her on the bed. "He's your brother and you'll help take care of him." Garrett sat on the edge of the bed, gathering his family close. In his eyes, Grace saw a depth of emotion that needed no words: gratitude, love, and the profound contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. As spring returned once more to the Wyoming territory, the Prescott Ranch continued to prosper. Garrett hired 2 young cowboys to help with the expanding herd, building a bunkhouse for them near the barn. Grace, recovered from William's birth, resumed her role as keeper of the accounts and household, balancing motherhood with her responsibilities. One evening in early May, as twilight painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace and Garrett sat on the porch of their home. Ella played nearby with a family of kittens born in the barn, while William slept peacefully in Grace's arms. "Do you ever think about that night?" Garrett asked, his gaze on the distant horizon. "When I found you and Ella by that dying fire," Grace nodded, following his gaze. "Often. Sometimes it seems like a lifetime ago, other times like yesterday." "I almost didn't ride that way," Garrett admitted. "Was heading straight home from town, but something told me to check the south pasture first." He reached over to take her hand. "Providence, like Mrs. Henderson would say." "Providence," Grace agreed, squeezing his fingers. "Or perhaps just the most fortunate wrong turn of my life." Garrett smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "When I saw you there, holding Ella, looking so determined even in such dire straits, I admired your courage before I even knew your name. And I thought you might be a mirage," Grace confessed. "The answer to a desperate prayer I hadn't even had the strength to utter." They sat in companionable silence, watching Ella's delighted play with the kittens and feeling William's steady breathing. The ranch spread before them, cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, spring grass turning the landscape emerald green. "We've built something good here," Garrett said finally. "Something that will last." Grace nodded, contentment filling her heart. From the ashes of tragedy and loss, they had forged a new beginning, not perfect, not without challenges, but founded on genuine love and mutual respect. "Yes," she agreed simply. "We have." As darkness fell and stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky, Garrett Prescott gathered his family and led them inside their home. The cabin that had once echoed with his solitary footsteps now rang with children's laughter and the quiet conversations of a couple deeply in love. The fire that burned in the hearth was steady and strong, much like the bond between the cowboy and the woman he had once found beside a dying flame. Life in the Wyoming territory remained challenging as the years passed, but Grace and Garrett faced each obstacle together, their partnership growing stronger with each season. Ella blossomed into a confident young girl with her mother's spirit and her adoptive father's steady demeanor. William, sturdy and inquisitive, shadowed Garrett's every move, eager to learn ranching skills from the father he adored. In the spring of 1880, they welcomed another daughter, Catherine Elizabeth, completing their family. The cabin that had once seemed spacious for a single man now bustled with activity, necessitating another expansion. With the help of neighbors and hired hands, Garrett built a proper two-story home adjacent to the original cabin, which became his office and a guest house for visitors. The Prescott Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Garrett's breeding program produced horses sought after throughout the territory, while Grace's careful financial management allowed them to weather the occasional economic downturns that affected the cattle industry. They diversified into sheep and established a small dairy operation that provided additional income during lean times. Education was important to both parents. Grace taught the children their letters and numbers until they were old enough to attend the schoolhouse built by the growing community 15 miles away. During winter months when travel was difficult, Garrett would take the children on his strongest horse to stay with the schoolteacher during the week, returning for them each Friday afternoon regardless of weather. "Learning is the one thing no one can take from you," he told them. Not banks, not thieves, not even bad luck. As the frontier towns grew into established communities, Grace became involved in social causes, particularly those supporting widows and orphans. Having experienced desperate circumstances firsthand, she worked tirelessly to ensure others received the help she had once needed. Garrett supported her efforts completely, often donating livestock or lumber for families rebuilding after hardship. Their home became known as a place of hospitality, where travelers could find a meal and travelers in need could find more substantial help. More than once, a woman with children and few prospects arrived at their door, sent by someone who knew the Prescott story. Each time, Grace and Garrett provided temporary shelter and helped the family find a path forward, whether through employment, introduction to potential suitors, or assistance relocating to areas with more opportunities. "We're just passing along the kindness that saved us," Grace would say when thanked. In 1885, nearly 10 years after Garrett had found Grace and Ella beside that dying fire, the family celebrated the expansion of their ranch to include the former Henderson property. The elderly couple, now too frail for independent living, moved to Denver permanently to live with their son, selling their land to the Prescotts at a price well below market value. "It should be yours," Mr. Henderson told them. "Always thought of you as family anyway." The additional acreage allowed Garrett to increase his herds significantly and gave the growing children room to explore and develop their own interests. Ella, now 10, showed remarkable aptitude with horses, while 9-year-old William preferred working with the cattle. 5-year-old Catherine, to everyone's amusement, declared her intention to become a doctor, solemnly treating injured animals with surprising gentleness. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Garrett surprised Grace with a trip to Denver, their first journey away from the ranch together since their marriage. The children stayed with trusted neighbors, while the couple spent a week experiencing the luxuries of city life, theatrical performances, restaurant meals, and the novelty of sleeping late without ranch responsibilities calling. Yet despite the city's attractions, both were eager to return home by the week's end. As their train approached the station where Garrett had arranged for a ranch hand to meet them with the wagon, Grace took her husband's hand. "Thank you for the wonderful trip," she said. "But I'm ready to go home." Garrett squeezed her fingers, understanding perfectly. "Me too. City's nice to visit, but it's not where we belong." The children greeted their return with enthusiasm, bombarding them with stories of everything that had happened in their absence. That evening, after the younger ones were asleep, 15-year-old Ella sat with her parents on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. "Mrs. Patterson told me the story again," she said suddenly. "About how you found us, Pa." Garrett glanced at his adopted daughter with affection. Though not his by blood, she was completely his in heart. "Mrs. Patterson likes a good tale," he said with a smile. "She says it was like something from a storybook," Ella continued. "A cowboy finding a woman and baby beside a dying fire, saving them from certain death." She looked at her mother. "Was it really that dramatic, Ma?" Grace reached for Garrett's hand, their fingers intertwining in the familiar gesture of partnership that had sustained them through a decade of marriage. "It was exactly that dramatic," she confirmed. "We would have died that night if your father hadn't found us." The storm was coming, we had no food, no shelter. She trailed off, the memory still powerful despite the years that had passed. I remember bits of it, Ella admitted. Not much, just being cold and then suddenly warm and feeling safe. She smiled at Garrett. I think I remember you holding me by a fire. Garrett cleared his throat, emotion making his voice husky. You were a tiny little thing, fit right in the crook of my arm. And now look at you, Grace marveled, taking in her daughter's developing beauty. Almost a young woman. Did you know right away, Ella asked, her expression curious, that you would fall in love and get married? Grace and Garrett exchanged glances, sharing the private memory of their gradual, beautiful journey from strangers to beloved partners. Not right away, Grace answered honestly. But sometimes the best love stories unfold slowly, day by day, until you realize the person beside you has become essential to your happiness. Garrett nodded. Like watching a sunrise. Happens so gradually you barely notice the change until suddenly the whole world is golden. Ella sighed contentedly, a romantic at heart despite her practical upbringing. I want a love story like that someday, she declared. You will have your own story, Grace assured her. Different from ours, but special in its own way. As darkness settled over the Wyoming prairie, the three remained on the porch, sharing stories and dreams beneath the vast canopy of stars. Inside the house, William and Catherine slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were cherished and protected. For Grace and Garrett Prescott, the journey that had begun beside a dying fire had led to a life richer and more fulfilling than either could have imagined on that desperate night. Their love, born of compassion and nurtured through shared purpose and deep respect, had created not just a family but a legacy of kindness that would echo through generations. Come home with me, Garrett had said on that fateful evening, offering shelter from a storm. Neither of them had realized then that home would become not just a place, but a state of being, the profound connection between two souls who had found in each other the perfect complement, the missing piece that made their lives complete. As the years continued to pass, their love remained the foundation upon which everything else was built, unwavering, enduring, a beacon that guided them through life's inevitable storms and celebrated its many joys. What had begun as an act of human kindness had blossomed into the most precious gift of all, a love that transformed, healed, and ultimately endured. In the vast and sometimes unforgiving landscape of the American West, Grace and Garrett Prescott had created something rare and beautiful, a true partnership of equals, a family bound by choice as much as circumstance, and a love story that would be told and retold long after they were gone. It was, in every sense, a journey that had led them home.